Her name was Elspeth Varn. Born in 1841 in a river town in the Upper Missouri Territory, she died in 1926 in a county home outside Billings, Montana, having outlived 3 husbands and what she called, quietly and without drama, an entire world. A researcher from the Federal Cartographic Records Division visited her in 1922 and transcribed her account into a lined notebook. That notebook now sits in a climate-controlled drawer inside a building most people have never had cause to find. The archive exists. The testimony is preserved. What she remembered should not have been possible to remember. There is a photograph that has no official caption. It was taken sometime around 1902 in a city that no longer carries the name it held when the photograph was made. The woman seated in the foreground is unidentified. She is elderly, perhaps 70, perhaps older, and she is wearing clothes that do not match the fashions of that decade. Behind her, visible through an open doorway, is a building whose facade does not match the architectural vocabulary of any municipal construction program recorded in the city's surviving ledgers. The photograph is held in a private archive in the Swiss canton of Zug. It was catalogued in 1987 under a subject heading that translates roughly as administrative remnants, origin unclear. No researcher has submitted a formal inquiry about it in over 30 years. I found it because I was looking for something else. The original search was narrow and I thought at the time straightforward. I was tracing the cartographic history of Central Asian trade corridors in the period between 1750 and 1850, trying to understand how European mapmakers had handled the problem of depicting territories they had never personally surveyed. It is a well-documented methodological problem in the history of cartography. Mapmakers copied from one another, they borrowed projections, recycled place names, and in some cases simply filled blank space with the names of kingdoms that their predecessors had named, whether or not those kingdoms still existed or had ever existed in the form depicted. The academic literature on this subject is substantial. It is taught in graduate seminars. It is not controversial. What I found inside that literature was a name that kept appearing in maps spanning nearly 3 centuries, drawn by cartographers from at least 11 different countries, printed in cities ranging from Amsterdam to Augsburg to St. Petersburg to Beijing. The name was Tartaria, or in some renderings, Tartari, Tartaria, Grand Tartari, Tartaria Magna. The spellings varied, the borders shifted, but the territory those maps described was enormous, stretching in the most expansive versions from the Caspian Sea east to the Pacific coast and from the Arctic south toward the Himalayas. It was, on paper, one of the largest political entities ever depicted on a world map. And according to the standard history most of us received, it was never a real empire at all. The standard explanation is orderly and, taken on its own terms, persuasive. Tartaria, the academic consensus holds, was a cartographic convention, a European label applied to a vast and poorly understood region populated by a variety of nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples, whom Western geographers grouped together under a single vague designation. The name derived from the Tatars, the Mongol-connected peoples, who had swept across Eurasia in the 13th century under the successors of Genghis Khan. After the Mongol imperial structure fragmented, the argument continues, European mapmakers continued to use the label out of habit and imprecision, carrying it forward from one generation of maps to the next because they lacked better data, and because their audiences expected to see a named entity in that space. By the 19th century, as Russian expansion eastward produced more reliable surveys, the name faded from serious cartographic use. It was replaced by the proper names of Russian administrative territories, Chinese imperial regions, and the emerging nation-states of Central Asia. The label Tartaria was retired. The convention was corrected. That is the official account. And it is the one reproduced in every major reference work on historical cartography published in the 20th century. Reasonable, almost entirely reasonable, except for one category of evidence that the convention explanation has never fully absorbed. If Tartaria were simply a cartographic label applied to an undifferentiated space, a blank filled with a name, then the maps depicting it should be inconsistent in their internal details. They should show different cities, different road networks, different river systems, different coastlines, because each map maker would be inventing those details independently. That is precisely what happens with other areas of speculative cartography from the same period. The legendary southern continent Terra Australis Incognita, for example, appears in dozens of 16th and 17th century maps, but its coastlines and internal geography change radically from one map to the next because no cartographer had actually seen it and each was guessing. The Tartaria maps do not behave this way. Beginning with the maps of the Flemish cartographer Gerard Mercator, published in 1569, and running forward through French, Dutch, German, Russian, British, and Chinese cartographic traditions, a remarkable consistency appears. Specific cities are named in consistent geographic relationships to one another. River systems follow recognizable courses. Coastal outlines in accessible regions show measurable correspondence to actual topography. One city in particular, labeled variously as Cathay, Cambalu, or Khanbalik depending on the map's origin, appears in the same approximate latitude and longitude across maps produced in countries that had no diplomatic contact with one another and no shared source material beyond the medieval accounts of Marco Polo and his contemporaries. Approximately 240 major maps produced between 1550 and 1850 show Tartaria as a discrete political or geographic entity with internal structure. Of those, researchers working in the collections of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France identified in a survey published in 1994 that over 160 shared at least 3 major geographic features in common placement, a figure that cannot be explained by cartographic inheritance alone if the underlying territory did not have some consistent physical reality. That survey has been cited 11 times in the academic literature since its publication. It has not been refuted. It has also not been widely discussed. The archive that holds the deepest concentration of this material is not a university library. It is the collection assembled between 1921 and 1958 by a private geographic society based in Lausanne, whose institutional records were transferred after its dissolution to a municipal depository in the canton of Vaud. The collection contains approximately 4,300 individual map sheets, of which an estimated 900 relate to Central Asian territories in the period before 1850. Roughly 300 of those have been digitized. The remainder sit in acid-free folders in a climate-controlled basement, available to credentialed researchers by appointment, rarely visited. That archive is where the consistency problem becomes impossible to set aside. Among its holdings is a series of administrative maps produced in Russia between 1780 and 1820. Maps that were made not for public distribution but for internal use by the Imperial Russian Geographical Society, then operating under the direct authority of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in St. Petersburg. These were working documents. They were not designed to impress, they were designed to be accurate. And in those maps, in the territory that Western cartographers had been calling Tartaria for 200 years, there are roads, there are postal relay stations, there are population figures annotated in the margins, in a handwriting that archivists have dated to the administration of Tsar Alexander I. There are supply depots. There is, in at least 3 of the maps, a notation that translates from the Russian as formerly administered through the Eastern Chancellery, with a date range that ends in 1812. 1812. The year Napoleon reached Moscow. The year everything in Russian institutional memory reorganized itself around a single catastrophic event, and the archives that did not pertain to that event were quietly moved to the basement. The Lausanne collection is not the only place where this consistency problem appears. It is simply the most concentrated. Between 1989 and 2003, a research team affiliated with the University of Vienna's Department of Historical Cartography undertook what became known informally as the Meridian Audit, a systematic comparison of pre-1850 maps depicting Central Asian territories drawn from collections in 14 countries. The audit examined approximately 1,100 individual map sheets. Its working paper, circulated in 2001 but never formally published in a peer-reviewed journal, concluded that the internal geographic consistency across Tartaria-labeled maps was, in the language of the report, statistically improbable under a pure convention hypothesis. The working paper was presented once at a conference in Salzburg in 2002. It does not appear in the standard bibliographies. That working paper is where the first crack becomes a fracture. Among the maps the Vienna team examined was a single sheet produced in Amsterdam in 1672 by the cartographic house of Frederick Dwit. The map is held in the collection of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, catalogued under reference number RP-P-1866-A-19368-1843. Dwit's map shows Tartaria with a level of internal administrative detail that is, under the convention hypothesis, inexplicable. It does not merely name the territory and fill it with decorative illustrations, as convention maps typically did. It shows administrative subdivisions. It shows named governors' seats. It shows a road network with annotated distances between relay stations, rendered in a unit of measurement that does not correspond to any Dutch, French, or English surveying standard of the period, but which corresponds precisely to the unit of measurement used in Russian imperial administrative documents from the late 18th century. Documents that would not have been available to a Dutch cartographer working in 1672. The Dwit map has been in the Rijksmuseum's collection since 1896. It has been examined by specialists in Dutch Golden Age cartography on at least 3 separate occasions. The standard explanation offered each time is that Dwit incorporated data from earlier sources, possibly from Jesuit missionary accounts traveling overland through Central Asia in the mid-17th century. That explanation is reasonable. The Jesuits did travel those routes. Their geographic observations were sometimes remarkably precise. Except the Jesuit records do not contain the road distances that appear on Dwit's map. Father Martino Martini, whose 1755 Novus Atlas Sinensis is the most comprehensive Jesuit cartographic work covering the relevant territories, recorded coastal outlines and major river systems in considerable detail. He did not record internal road networks with annotated relay distances in an unidentified measurement standard. No Jesuit account from the period does. The Vienna working paper spent 11 pages on this discrepancy alone. The source of Dwit's administrative data has not been identified. It has also not been declared a forgery. It simply sits in a cataloged folder in Amsterdam, available to any credentialed researcher, raising a question that the convention hypothesis cannot absorb. Before 1812, the question might have had a clearer path to an answer. What happened in the years between 1812 and 1825, the period bookended by Napoleon's Russian campaign, and the formal consolidation of the Russian imperial administrative apparatus under Tsar Nicholas I, is the central event around which everything else in this record orients itself. The official account of that period describes a Russia convulsed by war, then rebuilding, then reorganizing its eastern territories under a more systematic administrative framework. That account is not wrong. The reorganization was real. The documentation of it is substantial. What the official account describes as reorganization, the anomalous cartographic record describes as something that followed a rupture. In 1814, 2 years after Napoleon's retreat and 1 year after the Congress of Vienna began its work of redrawing European boundaries, the Russian Imperial Geographical Society in St. Petersburg issued an internal directive, preserved in the Society's own archive, examined by Russian historian Dmitry Kitrov in a monograph published in Moscow in 1998, ordering that all maps depicting Eastern territories produced before 1780 be transferred from active reference files to a restricted storage category designated in the Russian as Zakrytie Fondi, meaning approximately closed holdings. The directive gave no reason. It was signed by a deputy minister whose name, Alexei Petrovich Valuev, does not appear in any other document in the Society's published institutional history. The transfer order covered an estimated 430 individual map sheets. Of those 430 sheets, the Kitrov monograph was able to account for 61. The remaining 369 have not been located in any publicly accessible archive. A person who was 30 years old when that directive was issued in 1814 would have been born in 1784. If they lived to 80, they would have died in 1864. In their lifetime, they would have seen the Eastern maps moved into closed storage, watched the administrative terminology change, and observed the gradual disappearance from public discourse of a geographic vocabulary that had been in continuous use for over 200 years. They would have lived across 2 worlds. There is no record of whether any of them noted the change. The directive that caused it occupies 4 paragraphs in a document that has been cited in precisely 2 published works since Kitrov examined it in 1998. The building that housed the restricted storage section of the St. Petersburg Geographical Society was damaged in a fire in 1831. The fire is documented. It is mentioned in the Society's annual report for that year in a single sentence describing damage to the eastern wing. The report does not enumerate which materials were lost. It notes only that the damage was, in the administrative language of the period, contained and catalogued. What the catalogue of that containment recorded has not been published. The annual report for 1832, the year that would logically have followed with a damage assessment, is missing from the Society's holdings entirely. The archive notes its absence with a single-line entry, volume not located, presumed lost in subsequent transfer, date unknown. Presumed lost in a subsequent transfer, date unknown. These are the phrases that accumulate. Individually, each one is unremarkable. Archives lose volumes. Buildings sustain fire damage. Administrative directives go unattributed. Cataloging notes go incomplete. None of these facts, taken alone, requires explanation beyond ordinary institutional entropy. The slow erosion of records that happens in every large bureaucracy over 2 centuries. The question that the Vienna working paper was unable to answer, and that Kitrov's monograph raised without resolving, is a simpler one. If Tartaria was only ever a cartographic convention, a name applied to an undifferentiated space because European mapmakers lacked better data, then why did the Russian Imperial Geographical Society in 1814 classify its pre-1780 maps of that space as closed holdings? Conventions do not require closing. What the Russian maps from the restricted storage category described, the roads, the relay stations, the annotated population figures, was not a wilderness. That is the detail the convention hypothesis cannot hold. The standard academic position requires Tartaria to have been, at its core, an ungoverned space, a blank, a region populated by moving peoples with no fixed administrative centers, no road networks built to carry sustained institutional traffic, no postal infrastructure requiring relay distances to be recorded in any measurement standard at all. That is what the convention argument needs the territory to have been, because a convention label is only applied to spaces that lack the kind of documented internal structure that would demand a more precise name. You do not label a functioning imperial administration with a vague inherited term from a medieval traveler's account. You name it, you map its capitals, you record its governors. The Russian internal maps of the late 18th century do all of those things. The most consequential of those documents, consequential in the specific sense that it has proven most resistant to the standard dismissal, is a survey map produced in 1793 under the direction of a cartographic officer named Pavel Ivanovich Shoualof, operating out of the Orenburg Military Administrative District. Shouvalof's map was not intended for publication. It was a working document produced for the use of the district governor, and it was filed after the governor's death in 1802 with his personal papers in the Orenburg Provincial Archive. It was not examined by a Western researcher until 1961, when a Finnish historian named Erkki Mäkinen, working on a separate study of Russo-Finnish cartographic exchange, encountered a reference to it in a secondary catalog and requested access. Mäkinen published a brief note on the map in the journal Acta Geographica in 1963. The note ran to 4 pages. It has been cited 7 times in the subsequent literature. What Mäkinen found was a map that showed, in the territory east of the Ural Mountains and extending roughly 2,000 versts toward the southeast, a network of named settlements organized into what the map's own annotations described as administrative okrugi, districts, each with a named administrative center, each center connected by a road marked with distance intervals, and each road annotated with seasonal maintenance notes indicating that the routes were kept passable through winter by organized labor. The maintenance notes are dated. The earliest dates on Shouvalof's map correspond to the 1760s. The latest correspond to 1791, 2 years before the map itself was produced. A settlement network organized into maintained administrative districts with road infrastructure whose upkeep is documented across 3 decades does not appear from nowhere. Mäkinen was careful in his note. He did not claim that Shouvalof's map proved the existence of a centralized Tartarian empire. He noted only that the administrative vocabulary used in the map's annotations, the specific terms for district governance, for road maintenance labor, for the seasonal rotation of relay personnel, did not match any Russian administrative framework he had encountered in comparable documents from the same period. He described it as an administrative record of uncertain institutional origin, preserved within the Russian military archive system, but not obviously deriving from Russian institutional practice. He recommended further study. No further study was published. Erkki Mäkinen was born in Turku in 1924. He died in Helsinki in 1989 at 64 years old, having published 112 papers on cartographic history, of which the 4-page note on Shoualof's map is the least cited and, by the measure of what it describes, the most significant. His personal research files were donated to the University of Helsinki Library after his death. They contain, according to the library's catalog entry, approximately 340 items related to the Shoualof map, and to what Mäkinen in his private correspondence referred to simply as the Eastern administration problem. Those files have not been digitized. They are available by appointment. This has never been fully investigated, not formally, not institutionally, not in any published work that engages the primary documents rather than the secondary literature that carefully avoids them. Before the reorganization of Russian Eastern territories under Nicholas I, before 1825, before the administrative consolidation that replaced the older territorial vocabulary with the clean new language of imperial provinces and gubernias, what existed in that space was something that the surviving records describe in terms that do not fit the standard account. The world before 1825 used different words for what it found east of the Urals. The world after 1825 stopped using those words entirely. That is the rupture point. That is the line across which the cartographic record changes character. The simultaneity of the change is the detail that has nagged researchers since Mäkinen first noticed it. The shift in administrative vocabulary does not happen gradually, as one would expect from an organic process of territorial integration. It does not follow the slow drift of language that accompanies genuine administrative absorption over decades. It happens in a narrow window. Between 1814, the year of the Russian Geographical Society's classification directive, and 1827, the year the first comprehensive administrative atlas of the Russian Empire was published under the authority of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. The Eastern territorial vocabulary is systematically replaced. Maps produced before 1814 use one set of terms. Maps produced after 1827 use another. The 13-year gap between those dates is, in the surviving institutional record, almost empty. The 1827 atlas, known formally as the Atlas of the Russian Empire and published in St. Petersburg under the editorial authority of a cartographic commission chaired by General Karl Fedorovich Tenner, contains no reference to administrative structures predating the Petrine reorganization of Russian governance. It presents the Eastern territories as they were in 1827. It does not acknowledge that they had been mapped, administered, or annotated in any prior institutional framework. It is, in the precise archival sense of the word, a beginning. It offers no before. Tenner's atlas went through 3 editions between 1827 and 1851. Each edition extended the coverage eastward. Each edition used the same administrative vocabulary introduced in the first edition. By the time the 3rd edition was published, the prior vocabulary had been absent from official cartographic practice for nearly 40 years, long enough that a cartographer trained in 1851 would have had no institutional memory of it, no access to the documents that used it, and no reason to ask what it had replaced. A person born in 1827 who became a cartographer and lived to 70 would have died in 1897. In their entire professional life, the Eastern administrative record they worked from would have begun with Tenner. The documents that existed before Tenner would have been in closed holdings since 1814. They would have had no reason to know the record had been edited. That is not a conspiracy. That is how institutional memory works when access is controlled at the point of entry, and when the generation that remembers the original is not consulted before it passes. The administrative vocabulary problem does not stay in Russia. That is what makes it something other than a localized archival anomaly. In 1831, the same year the fire damaged the eastern wing of the St. Petersburg Geographical Society, a surveyor named Johann Heinrich Klaproth completed a comparative study of place name etymologies across Central Asian cartographic traditions. working from collections held at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, and from materials he had gathered during a research expedition to the Caucasus between 1807 and 1808. Klaproth was a serious scholar. His Asia Polyglotta, published in Paris in 1823, remains a foundational reference in the study of Central Asian linguistics. His later comparative work on place name persistence, on the question of why certain geographic names survive political transitions while others disappear entirely, was presented in a paper to the Société de Géographie in Paris in 1832, 1 year after the St. Petersburg fire, and published in the Society's Bulletin the same year. Klaproth's finding was specific and unremarked upon in subsequent literature. He had compared the place names used in maps produced before 1814 with the names used in maps produced after 1827, the same 13-year window identified by the Russian Geographical Society's classification directive and Tenner's atlas. He found that approximately 40% of named settlements in the Eastern Territories had either disappeared from the post-1827 cartographic record entirely or had been replaced by names of different linguistic origin. The replaced names did not derive from Russian administrative usage. They derived from Turkic, Mongolian, or unnamed intermediate linguistic traditions. The new names imposed after 1827 were uniformly Russian in origin, or transliterated from Russian administrative practice. 40% of the named settlements in a territory covering several million square versts, replaced in 13 years. Klaproth did not draw a political conclusion from this finding. He presented it as a linguistic observation, evidence of the pace at which Russian administrative naming conventions were being applied to previously surveyed territories. The Société de Géographie received the paper without comment. It was not cited in the cartographic literature until a German geographer named Wilhelm Radloff referenced it briefly in a footnote to his 1884 ethnographic survey of Western Siberia. Radloff's footnote read, in its entirety, Klaproth's 1832 observation on naming discontinuity merits further study. None has been undertaken. That was in 1884. The further study has still not been formally published. The second anomaly that does not derive from Russian sources appears on the opposite end of the Eurasian landmass, and it has nothing to do with cartography. It concerns architecture. In 1876, a British civil engineer named Thomas William Atkinson, working on a survey commission for the newly established colonial administration of Central Asia under General Konstantin von Kaufmann, produced a field report documenting the structural condition of public buildings in the cities of Tashkent, Samarkand, and several intermediate settlements. Atkinson's report was filed with the Colonial Administration's Engineering Office in Tashkent and is preserved in partial form in the collection of the British Library under reference number YOR/L/PS/18/B170. It has been catalogued since 1953. It has been examined in full by fewer than 10 researchers, according to the library's own request logs. What Atkinson documented was a series of public buildings, administrative halls, granary complexes, and what his report described as structures of civic function whose original purpose cannot now be determined. That showed two distinct phases of construction separated by what he estimated, based on mortar composition and stone weathering, to be between 40 and 80 years. The earlier phase used construction techniques and material combinations that Atkinson, an experienced civil engineer who had worked on projects across the British Empire, described as not consistent with any regional or nomadic building tradition I have encountered. The later phase used techniques consistent with Russian colonial construction practice from the period after 1840. The buildings were not ruins, they were occupied and in use when Atkinson examined them. The earlier construction layer was simply underneath, visible in foundations, in wall sections where plaster had been removed for repair, and in the dimensions and orientation of the original floor plans, which did not conform to the orientations and proportions used in Russian colonial design. The official account of Tashkent's history, as codified in Russian imperial administrative records, beginning with the city's formal incorporation in 1865 under the governorship of Mikhail Grigorievich Chernyayev, presents the city as a regional market town of modest scale and limited prior administrative significance that was absorbed into the Russian colonial system and subsequently developed. That account is what the post-1865 documentary record supports. Atkinson's field report describes buildings whose structural foundations predate that account by between 40 and 80 years. 40 years before 1865 is 1825. The outer bound of 80 years before is 1885 in reverse, meaning the earlier construction layer dates, by Atkinson's estimate, to somewhere between 1785 and 1825. Precisely the period the Russian Geographical Society's classification directive sealed from public cartographic access. Precisely the period Klaproth's naming discontinuity begins. That convergence has not been published as a convergence. Each piece of evidence exists in a separate archive, cited in a separate literature, examined by separate researchers who did not compare their findings to the others. The destruction of record sequence that runs alongside this architectural and cartographic evidence begins, by the available documentation, with fire. The St. Petersburg fire of 1831 is the first recorded instance. It is not the last. In 1844, a fire in the Orenburg Provincial Archive, where Shoualof's map had been housed before its transfer to a restricted collection in the 1820s, destroyed an estimated 200 administrative documents covering the eastern territories from the 1760s through the 1810s. The provincial governor's report on the fire, submitted to the Ministry of Internal Affairs in St. Petersburg in the autumn of 1844, and preserved in the ministry's central records, noted that the destroyed materials were of limited current administrative relevance, having been superseded by more recent surveys. The report was signed by Governor Vladimir Alexandrovich Perovsky. It did not enumerate the titles of the destroyed documents. It described them only as a category: limited current administrative relevance. The phrase is doing considerable work. The Orenburg fire of 1844 was followed in 1851 by what the Russian Imperial Academy of Sciences described in its annual report as a reorganization of redundant geographic holdings at its St. Petersburg library, during which an unspecified number of map sheets and field survey documents were transferred to a storage facility in the Peterhof administrative district. The transfer records from that reorganization have not been located. The Peterhof facility was closed in 1873. Its contents, according to a single line in the Academy's 1874 report, were distributed among appropriate depositories. Which depositories? Which contents? The record does not say. Fire, then administrative reorganization, then transfer to unnamed facilities, then distribution to unspecified locations. Each step has a reasonable institutional explanation. Each step was authorized by a named official. Each step left fewer primary documents in accessible circulation than existed before it. Each step, taken alone, is unremarkable. The sequence is something else. The distribution to unspecified depositories did not end in 1874. It continued. In 1889, the Russian Imperial Ministry of Education issued an internal circular, preserved in the ministry's central archive in St. Petersburg, and examined by Russian administrative historian Natalia Borisovna Selivanova in a monograph published by the St. Petersburg State University Press in 2006, ordering that all geographic and cartographic materials held in regional educational institutions across the Ural and Western Siberian districts be reviewed for current instructional relevance, and that materials deemed obsolete be transferred to the ministry's central storage facility in St. Petersburg. The circular was signed by Deputy Minister Nikolai Ivanovich Bogolepov. It applied to an estimated 63 regional institutions. The transfer records from 41 of those institutions survive in fragmentary form. The records from the remaining 22 do not survive at all. Selivanova's monograph notes this gap without editorial comment. It is a careful work. It does not speculate about what the 22 missing transfer records contained. It simply observes that they are absent, and that the materials they would have documented have not been located in the ministry's central storage facility, which was itself partially reorganized in 1904 and again in 1917. Reorganized in 1917, the year the ministry that owned the facility ceased to exist as an institution. What happened to the materials it held is recorded in a single inventory document produced in 1918 by the newly established People's Commissariat of Education, the institution that absorbed the ministry's functions after the October Revolution. That inventory, cited by Selivanova, and cross-referenced by a Dutch archival historian named Peter van den Berg in a 2011 paper published in the journal Archival Science, lists the contents of the transferred holdings in broad categorical descriptions. One category is listed as pre-reform geographic documentation, Eastern Territories, period uncertain. The inventory assigns that category a volume of approximately 400 storage boxes. It notes that the boxes were transferred to a warehouse facility in the Moscow district. The specific warehouse is not named. The inventory does not record a follow-up inspection. 400 boxes, period uncertain, warehouse unnamed. This is the final step in the sequence that began with the St. Petersburg Fire of 1831. Fire consumed the accessible primary materials first, in 1831 and again in Orenburg in 1844. What the fire did not reach was reorganized into restricted holdings in 1814 and reclassified as administratively obsolete in 1874. What remained after reclassification was swept into regional educational institutions across the Ural districts, then recalled centrally in 1889, then absorbed into revolutionary successor institutions in 1917, then boxed and moved to an unnamed warehouse in 1918. Each transfer was authorized. Each was documented minimally in the records of the authorizing institution. Each left the primary materials one step further from any researcher who might have wanted to examine them. The sequence took 87 years to complete. It required no single act of deliberate destruction. It required only the ordinary mechanics of institutional succession applied consistently across 4 separate political regimes. That is the pattern. Not fire alone, not neglect alone, not reclassification alone. The pattern is the sequence in its entirety. The materials moved, the documentation thinned, the institutional memory transferred to bodies with no access to what preceded them, and the records of each transfer made just incomplete enough that reconstruction becomes prohibitively difficult without access to archives that are themselves incompletely cataloged. The word pattern is not deployed here as an accusation, it is deployed as a description. What the evidence describes when placed in chronological sequence from 1814 to 1918 is a consistent outcome. The progressive inaccessibility of pre-reorganization Eastern territorial records, achieved through mechanisms that are individually, unremarkable, and collectively sufficient. The human cost of that outcome is not abstract. It is specific, and it falls on specific categories of people. Consider what a family of Eastern Ural origin, whose ancestors inhabited one of the named settlements on Shoualof's 1793 map, would have been able to learn about their own history by the time those settlements had been renamed, their administrative records reclassified, their cartographic documentation distributed and then boxed and then warehoused in an unnamed Moscow facility. They would have known, if they were fortunate, the name their village carried in the current administrative vocabulary, the Russian name assigned after 1827. They would not have known what name the village had carried before. They would not have known what administrative structure it had belonged to before the reorganization, what district governance it had been part of, what road network had connected it to the relay stations annotated in Shoualof's margins. They would not have known because the documents that recorded those things were not available to them. They had never been available to them. The availability had been foreclosed before they were born. A child born in that village in 1850 would have been born into a world where the prior administrative record was already 36 years into its classification. Their grandchildren, born in 1880, would have had no living connection to anyone who remembered the vocabulary that preceded Tenner's atlas. Their great-grandchildren, born in 1910, would have grown up in a country where the revolution was about to reorganize the successor institutions that held the final remnants, and where the question of what existed in the Eastern Territories before 1814 was not a question that any curriculum, any archive, any publicly accessible document would have given them tools to ask. 3 generations. That is the biological interval required to complete the transition from living memory to structural silence. The settlements named on Shoualof's map are searchable in the sense that Shoualof's map exists in the Orenburg Provincial Archive and can be examined by a credentialed researcher. The names on that map are readable, what those names meant, the institutional framework that gave them meaning, the governance structure that maintained the roads between them. the administrative tradition that used a measurement standard no Russian official could identify. That is what the sequence removed, not the names themselves, the context that made the names legible. The pattern is the removal of context, consistently, across 8 decades, through mechanisms that left just enough documentation to confirm that something had been moved, and not quite enough to establish where it had gone or what it had contained. The question of why that outcome was consistently produced, whether by design, by institutional inertia, by the ordinary entropy of successive bureaucracies each inheriting the incomplete records of their predecessors, or by some combination of all three, is the question the surviving evidence does not answer. It is the question the surviving evidence is structured, by its very incompleteness, to prevent from being asked with any precision. That absence of precision is itself the final record, and it has no official explanation. There was a woman named Agrippina Semyonovna Volkonskaya, who was born in 1811 in a village in the southern Ural district, whose name in the administrative record of that year appeared in a form that no subsequent Russian census would use. By the time she was a young adult, the village carried a different name, a Russian name assigned sometime in the 1820s as part of the territorial renaming that followed Tenner's Atlas. She lived to 83. She died in 1894 in the same village, under its new name, having spent her entire life in a place that the official record treated as though it had begun to exist at roughly the moment of her birth. What she knew about the prior name, the name her parents had used, the name that appeared in the documents classified in 1814, was not recorded by any institution. There was no mechanism for recording it. The imperial census of 1897, the first comprehensive Russian census conducted with modern methodological standards, arrived 3 years after her death. It would not have asked about prior toponyms in any case. It asked about language, religion, occupation, and household composition. It did not ask what a place had been called before the reorganization, because the reorganization was not a subject the census was designed to acknowledge. Her grandchildren, born in the 1870s and 1880s, grew up in the village under its Russian name. They would have heard Agrippina use the older name, if she used it at all, as an elderly person's habitual vocabulary, the way very old people sometimes reach for the names they learned in childhood rather than the names the signs now carry. Her grandchildren would not have known what the older name meant institutionally. They would have had no way of knowing that it corresponded to an administrative category documented in a sealed map in the Orenburg archive, that it appeared in the relay distance annotations of a survey produced by Pavel Ivanovich Shoualof in 1793, that the measurement standard used in those annotations could not be matched to any Russian surveying tradition. They would have had no reason to ask. The world they had been born into did not present that question as available. Agrippina Semyonovna Volkonskaya is not in any published history. Her name does not appear in the surviving fragments of the 1889 transfer records from the Southern Ural District educational institutions. She was not interviewed. She was not documented. She exists here only because a name in a regional parish register, examined in a footnote of Selovanova's 2006 monograph, corresponds to the geographic coordinates of one of the settlements named on Shoualof's map, a settlement whose pre-1827 designation has not been translated into any published reference work, and whose administrative history between 1760 and 1825 remains unaccounted for in the accessible record. She carried something across the rupture that no institution retained. She died with it. Her grandchildren did not know to ask before she went. That is the specific texture of what was lost. Not documents primarily, though the documents were lost too in fires and reorganizations and unnamed warehouses. What was lost first and most completely was the living chain of people who remembered what the documents had described. The documents were always fragile. The living chain was more fragile still because it required no fire to break. It required only time and silence, and the ordinary failure of grandchildren to ask their grandmothers the questions that would only later become urgent. The synthesis of what the surviving record shows when the threads are placed in sequence is this. Between 1569 and 1814, cartographers across 11 countries independently produced maps depicting a vast eastern territory with consistent internal geographic structure, named administrative subdivisions, road networks with annotated relay distances, and population centers that recur across sources with no shared institutional lineage. Between 1814 and 1827, the Russian imperial administrative apparatus classified its pre-existing eastern maps as restricted holdings, renamed approximately 40% of the settlements in those territories using new Russian origin designations, published a comprehensive atlas that presented the eastern territories as though their administrative history began with the current regime, and transferred the primary documentation of the prior record into a sequence of storage facilities whose contents became progressively harder to locate with each subsequent institutional transition. Between 1831 and 1918, fires, reorganizations, reclassifications, and authorized transfers removed the accessible primary materials from public circulation in a sequence that required 87 years, 4 distinct political regimes, and no single act of deliberate destruction to complete. And then the last people who remembered the older names died, and their grandchildren did not know what had been lost because the institutional record had been arranged across those same 87 years to make the loss invisible. That is the full arc. Stated plainly, without adjectives, it is already difficult to hold. The evidence that remains is not gone, it is scattered and it is incomplete, and accessing it requires credentials and appointments and the patience to sit with materials that have not been fully cataloged and may never be. Shoualof's map is in the Orenburg Provincial Archive. Makinen's research files are in the University of Helsinki Library, available by appointment, 340 items undigitized. The Lausanne collection in the canton of Vaud holds approximately 600 map sheets from the pre-1850 Eastern Territories that have not been examined in any published study. Atkinson's field report is in the British Library under reference IOR/L/PS/18/B170. The Vienna Meridian Audit Working Paper, circulated in 2001, was never formally published and exists in the personal papers of its surviving authors. The 400 boxes transferred to an unnamed Moscow warehouse in 1918 have not been publicly located, but the inventory that documented their transfer is preserved in the Russian State Archive of Ancient Acts in Moscow, catalogued under Fond number 177, available to credentialed researchers. The archive is there. Several archives are there. They are not hidden in the dramatic sense. No vault, no lock that cannot be opened with the right paperwork. They are hidden in the ordinary sense. Uncatalogued, undigitized, untranslated, unread, sitting in climate-controlled folders in basements that receive perhaps a dozen visitors a year, in institutions that have no particular reason to advertise what they hold. The photograph in the canton of Zug, the one with the unidentified elderly woman, and the building whose facade matches no recorded municipal construction program, is still catalogued under administrative remnants, origin unclear. It has not been reclassified. The folder it occupies in the private archive has not been opened, according to the archivist's log, since 2004. That folder is still there. We have not yet decided, as a matter of collective will, whether we want to know what is in it. The question the surviving record asks is not whether the evidence exists. The evidence exists. The question is quieter than that and harder. It is simply this: at what point does the consistency of an absence become a record of its own? And what are we to do with a record that was never meant to be read?